Welcome to this episode of the Patrick Coffin Show. The doors to Coffin Nation are now open. Go to coffinnation.com. Watch the trailer. You might find it's for you. When we launched over a year ago, we were not prepared for how well the community is able to finish each other's sentences, whether you're from Australia or Japan or the UK, all across the United States. 18 countries now and growing. So check out coffinnation.com. It's the largest culture restoring website community on the planet, if not the visible galaxy. So coffinnation.com. Okay, the topic is one I've visited before and am doing so now, and that is the unjust imprisonment of George Cardinal Pell. On November 19th, the High Court of Australia agreed to take up what will be his final appeal to the allegations that he sexually abused two teenage choir boys in 1996 in Melbourne after Mass at the cathedral. Joining me to talk about this is Australian journalist and TV presenter Andrew Bolt, who is here and will be after these short seconds. So happy to welcome Andrew Bolt to the broadcast. He's an Australian social and political commenter. He's worked at the Melbourne-based newspaper companies, the Herald and Weekly Times and the Herald Sun. He's currently a blogger and a columnist and host of the popular television show The Bolt Report, heard each weeknight on Sky News. Andrew, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me, Patrick. This is an important topic.
It is. I'm a bit of an outsider, not being from Australia. You're certainly an insider. But in another way, you're an outsider because people might look at me and they say, well, Patrick Coffin is a Catholic. He wants to protect someone he looks up to, one of the good guys. But you're not a theist or even a Christian. I think that's an important piece of the story.
Yes, I know. To a lot of people who say, why don't you join the church? I'm saying I'm doing the Lord's work outside it. I'm an agnostic. Mm-hmm. And I hope that would make people think that I don't have a vested interest to some extent in this, and that perhaps they should look at the facts of the matter and not sort of dig in behind ideological or religious trenches.
Mm-hmm. How did you get into the Life Journalistic? I'm reminded when I view your content, which I have for a couple of years, Andrew. You're an excellent presenter, and I think you're devoted to the way, not the way things ought to be, but the way they are. You are definitely fact-based. I'm reminded of the line from G.K. Chesterton, the great English writer, who said, he believed in getting into hot water. It keeps you clean. By that standard, you were in a constant state of aseptic purity, Ben.
In that case, I'm very, very pure indeed. Scalded, in fact. I probably should check myself out for third-degree burns.
Right.
Look, part of it, I always wanted to be a writer, and journalism, of course, is one area where you get paid to do it. So that's basically it. I thought it'd be good at nothing else, and here I am. And the fact is, I think I welcome trouble. Quote another book, Zorba the Greek, where
Mm-hmm.
life is taking your belt off and looking for trouble. But really, it's more. I honestly think that truth should matter, and people will say, yes, of course it should, but I'm afraid we're living in a postmodernist time where facts are what people say they are. You can say you're a man if you're a woman, or a woman if you're a man. You can say you're of a particular race when you're not, and it doesn't matter. It's to some circles. So in this issue, I think it's important, simply to fight for the truth, but here we're also talking about fighting for justice for a man that I think has been unfairly convicted, palpably unfairly convicted, in what I believe is for us the Dreyfus affair of our times. I think this is really a man being jailed for the crime of being a Catholic priest.
For people who are not familiar with the Dreyfus affair, it's a famous scapegoating incident where someone was similarly jailed. What would the what we call over here the Cliff Notes? What's the compressed version of the Dreyfus affair?
Well, you could take almost any of the race-based verdicts of America's past. You can look at, I don't know, what's that Gregory Peck movie, To Kill a, the book To Kill a Mockingbird. This kind of thing, where someone is convicted not for what they've done, but for the tribe or,
Hmm.
say, the tribe to which they belong. This is a reversion to a sort of barbaric times when before we thought, well, the Christian message really, the individual is what counts. It's not,
Hmm.
parable of the Good Samaritan, all that. It's the individual that counts. And I think that has been totally lost in the jailing of George Pell.
It's certainly not limited to the secularism we see rising in Australia. We see that in Canada, in the UK, and England, and the United States. I've interviewed Gavin McGuinness and Milo Yiannopoulos. I think both are banned from Australian soil for their aseptically impure opinions. As an outsider, Andrew, to the Christian faith, do you notice a kind of a more muscular or assertive anti-Christian animus? When I look at the crowds that surrounded Cardinal Pell as he's going in and out from the van to the trials in the last couple of years, there's definitely a mob rage, a kind of a groupthink. I mean, they don't just dislike him; they despise him. You can almost see it in the video, leaking out like heat off of a radiator. And I wonder if that would be true if he was a soccer coach or a public school teacher.
No, look, this has been a carefully cultivated hostility, a fury, a witch hunt sort of atmosphere. It's been going on for some time. I mean, I noticed when Cardinal Pell was made Archbishop of Melbourne, which is probably the most left-wing city in Australia, and the animus towards him then was remarkable because he was reforming the Christian education system, for instance, making it a little bit more true to the faith and true to the facts. And the hostility was quite amazing. Now, that has gone on for 20 or 30 years. That's really, really built up to an extraordinary degree. By the time that he came to face committal hearings and then the trial itself, it was to an absolute fever point. He had had songs played on the national broadcaster, for instance. Imagine NPR on steroids with $1 billion a year in Australian terms, because we're much smaller. $1 billion a year here is a lot of taxpayer funds. Imagine that. The crowds by then were the national broadcaster played a song parodying him, calling him scum, things like that, right? And had led a witch hunt, making allegations against him, for instance, that he'd fondled boys in a swimming pool. Allegations so thin that they didn't even make it to trial.
Yeah,
that's how bad they were. So by the time it came to the trial itself, we had crowds outside that resembled something like out of the Salem witch trials, without a shadow of a doubt. I do not exaggerate here. The screaming, the abuse, the spitting, the threats, it was absolutely extraordinary. So bad, in fact, that the trial judge, in his in sentencing Pell, after the jury found against him, went out of his way to make a comment about how disgraceful that had been, because he was shocked. I think so many Australians were shocked, but also, unfortunately, intimidated, and which is why so few spoke in his defence in what was clearly a preposterous verdict, and then later on, a preposterous decision to overturn his appeal.
you can almost, and I'm going to put a link to some of the footage at patrickcoffin.media. You can almost hear the whisper, or the seething, crucify him. I mean, it's definitely a sort of a diabolical scapegoating, independent of the facts. And of course,
look, I think when you say crucify him, it is straight out of the New Testament. It is straight out of, Ecce Homo, behold the man. And yes, crucify him. It wasn't for what he had done. It was for what he represented, and a threat to the sort of project to remake Australian, to remove Christianity from the cultural influences in this country.
a lot of people are not aware that Cardinal Pell is a historian, Oxford trained, and has a big picture look at a lot of trends that people who live on Twitter, they can't comprehend. They're just too venal for it, or too focused on sloganeering. And I've read enough about the things that Cardinal Pell has addressed, such as the rise of militant Islam, how that has worked out in Australian society. He was a skeptic, is a skeptic of the climate change hysteria, and certainly represents a kind of conservatism and dynamic orthodoxy that he just gores every possible ox you can gore to the leftists who seem to control so much of the narrative there in Australia. Am I overplaying the card?
No, I think you're underplaying the card, Patrick, because I think when you look at it, Christianity in its history has traditionally been opposed to religions or sort of neo-religions or sort of, almost messianic beliefs, communism, for instance, that put the individual underneath the wishes, the desire, the great, big thing like the fatherland or
That's
the
right.
international brotherhood or something, that the humans are subservient to the ideology.
Yeah.
And in the two examples you mentioned, the new religions or the ones that have been protected or sided with by the militant left, which are Islam and global warming, which is a replacement faith. These are two faiths to which really Christianity should be opposed. And he has been opposing them, and I think he's really paying for that too, particularly his skepticism on global warming. Global warming is in fact a new animistic faith, and he's called it out from the start. And I think that has driven a lot of the fury against him for a lot of the time.
Yeah, I remember him identifying it with the product of fear as product. So if you there's a Johnny Cash line, they want the kingdom of God, but they don't want God in it. If there's no heaven, no God, nothing transcendent, then this world is our only shot at utopia. So we're going to build heaven on earth. And you have to keep this kingdom going by throwing tax dollars at it, which is what the activists seem to want to do with climate change, as though money is somehow going to alter temperature patterns. And I think he's so well described the faith aspect of the climate change movement, which had to rebrand itself because global warming wasn't gaining any traction.
Well, I think he's also spotted some remarkable parallels between global warming and Christianity. Really, the way global warming is phrased is almost straight out of the Christian eschatology, except with God removed. I mean, it's like, repent for the end of the world is nigh, meet your judgment. You have to do, don't eat fish on a Friday, token gestures that don't actually go to anything, but symbolize that you're good. So, sort your plastic from your paper and your rubbish bins, things like that, even though in Australia, like a third of the councils, all the rubbish goes to the same tip. It doesn't matter. You've got to do it. It's one of those ritual things. And of course, then the hand of God, or in fact, the hand of global warming, seen behind everything. The other day, or just this week, we had our national airline Qantas, or supposedly national airline Qantas, say, look, sorry, we've had all these cancellations and delays in the last few months. Global warming, extra wings. When you look at the research, of course, the other day, last year, we saw a study saying global winds were, in fact, 25% down because of global warming. But Qantas thinks, oh, no, well, if suddenly had winds for the last 4 months, that's global warming. That kind of thing, this mystical, this devilish presence behind everything that goes bad, whether you got more skin cancers or, you didn't get the lottery coming your way, global warming.
Yeah, it's the convenient catch-all.
Yeah, absolutely.
I recently watched your walk with what looks like a cell phone camera, and because I want to slowly get into the allegations by, I guess the accusers called A in the documents. We've never been able to see a transcript. He's never appeared on video. We literally, because we weren't in the room, we weren't privy to the precise wording of the allegation. And people have to remember, Cardinal Pell is in jail because of one person's word that was contradicted by his fellow chorister, who's since deceased, who said he was never sexually abused. So all of it, and I read as much of it, I read the analysis by Professor John Finnis, I read Justice Mark Weinberg's dissenting opinion, and the accuser is all over the map. His story is not consistent. lots of holes in it. But the justices in their wisdom who decided to reject his appeal said that it had the ring of truth. He just seemed to come off as legitimate.
It's extraordinary. I mean, to reach another historical parallel that should tell us where exactly we are. I mean, I've talked about Salem and, whatever. If you go to Venice, the Doge's Palace, there's a little gap, a little hole in the wall where people used to be able to do anonymous denunciations of people with severe consequences. This is exactly that. It's just sick. We have had a court process where a man who we are not allowed to identify, and I know who he is, and I know a little bit about his background. If I could identify him to you and tell you more about him, I'd be breaking the law, but you would be even more startled as to why this man is the sole authority. There are things about his background that would make you very much question his word. Not only that, the evidence that he gave against George Pell, we're not allowed to know. The jury's allowed to know. You aren't, I am not, nor is the wider public. And this is important because what if other people who knew him would say, wait a minute, this doesn't gel with what I know about him or the facts. This is justice in secret to some extent. Obviously, it was a public hearing. That alone is suspicious. But it's particularly suspicious given that, as you say, this is one person's word against all the other witnesses, against all the other evidence, and more particularly against what the other guy that he says was raped with him, 2 choristers, raped at once, at the same time, by George Pell. The other guy told his mum twice, I wasn't assaulted. And yet this guy is believed despite so many problems with his evidence. He said, I was assaulted by Cardinal Pell just after Mass, despite the fact that the evidence shows George Pell was usually in the front of the cathedral saying goodbye to the parishioners. This assault is supposed to have taken place within 5 or 6 minutes after the end of Mass. He was at the top. People swore on oath that it was their duty, one as the MC of the Mass, never to leave his side, and he couldn't remember when he last did, right? So that is supposed to have happened in an open room with an unlocked door when others said it was normally very busy. He rapes 2 guys at once who he didn't know. For all he knew, one of them was the son of a policeman, for all he knew, who was waiting outside. Yeah. And normally there's a grooming involved. He did this out of character. In so many years, nothing. There was nothing, no previous for this and no post either. Then there were consistencies with the evidence. Like the guy said, the accuser said, we went in there, my friend and I, and we found altar wine. We drank it. It was red. No, it was white. He said, this happened in such and such a time. No, it was a different period completely. They checked the record, so he altered his evidence to suit the only times that George Pell was actually there. There's so many inconsistencies. But when you mentioned I take the walk, what I found most extraordinary about the decision by 2 or 3 judges to dismiss George Pell's appeal was to repeat this attack allegedly took place 5 or 6 minutes after the end of the Mass. From the man's own evidence, the accuser's own evidence, for almost all that time, he was not inside the cathedral being raped. He was outside the cathedral in a procession of choristers by his own evidence. How could he have been raped for what the judges said must have been 5 minutes in a 5 or 6 minute window before the sacristy became so full of people moving things to and from the sanctuary? How could he have been inside for 5 minutes being raped when he was outside in the procession of choristers after the Mass, walking up the aisle, around the side of the cathedral, down to a gate, which would have taken 3.5 minutes by my counting. And then he said he somehow, and no one noticed him, ran half the way back or walked half the way back, went to a side gate, then came around and into the sacristy, and then looked around, found some wine, drank it. What's that? 2 more minutes.
Yep.
It could not have happened.
Andrew, much has been made about the similarities between the accuser against Cardinal Pell and a September 2011 story from Rolling Stone magazine by a woman named Sabrina Rubin Erdley called The Catholic Church's Secret Sex Crime Files. Here are the similarities, and I'm bringing this up for a reason. Both cases of sexual abuse occurred in the sacristy after Sunday Mass. In both cases, the victims had been drinking wine they found there. In both cases, both boys assisted in the celebration of the Mass. The priest fondled both boys' genitals. Both boys were made to kneel before the priest. Both boys were made to perform fellatio on the priest. I mean, I hate reading all this. One more. Both the alleged victims were the only witnesses who testified for the prosecution in court. It was their word against that of the priests. Well, thanks to the writing of a guy called Ralph Cipriano in Newsweek in February 20th, 2016, I have all these links at patrickcoffin.media. The accuser in the Philadelphia case, reported by Rolling Stone, is a damnable liar. It didn't happen. He's a serial accuser who has absolutely no credibility. So this is a double irony, right? All the similarities that could have been read by the accuser itself is based on falsehoods.
Well, excuse me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Rolling Stone article mentioned one boy being accused.
Yeah,
right.
I think they're accusing. I think there's
Whereas
parallels
here the case-
between both sets of accusers.
Yes,
Yeah,
but otherwise
right.
the same. Well, look, I think that's absolutely remarkable, the similarities. But I'm not going to rest my case on whether where the inspiration came from. In some ways, it's one of those Baroque kind of things, images. I drank the priest's wine and then he raped me, kind of thing. It's so strange. But the issue here with the Rolling Stone article, there are other examples too. The mania that we've had, the stress over the last, decade perhaps, believe the victim. If you don't believe the victim, you're re-traumatizing that person, not just that person, but any victim anywhere. And if you do that, then other victims will be reluctant to come forward. So it's almost like a social duty in the greater cause. And whenever people talk about the greater cause, is when your antenna should go up. In the greater cause, it is important to believe the victim, which is in fact the allegation made against the 2 judges that turned down the appeal, plus the jury, believing the victim in the absence of corroborating evidence. In fact, worse than that, despite all the evidence contradicting them. And in this Pell case, it was a lot. Now, believing the victim comes with a huge problem. The dissenting judge in this case, Justice Weinberg, you mentioned his name before, warned about this, warned that judges were no better than anyone else at sorting out who looked a plausible, credible, look, he's telling the truth. Look at him. He's, he wouldn't lie. Look at his face. Than anyone else. But we have actually seen juries and judges and police, senior police, fooled again and again, because heaven knows some people either lie or they're fully convinced of something that cannot be true, but they believe it to be true for one reason or another. You saw it in the Rolling Stone article, the case. You've seen it in those amazing cases that swept through America, I think in the 1990s, where people are making the most amazing allegations in childcare centres,
That's right.
preschool, that, things like the kids would come in and these satanic people would have satanic rituals, and they even killed the child, threw it to sharks. They sent them to Mexico. They were raped there and then brought back that night. People believe this. People went to jail for this nonsense. And in Britain, for instance, the same hysteria at the same time swept over to there as well. And just the other day, we saw Carl Beach, a notorious liar, believed by the police in Britain. And he was making allegations against a former prime minister and former politicians and former top police officers that, he and his friends had been raped and someone was murdered. And he's just been jailed for being a liar too. It is a mistake to believe what someone says simply because they said it and they look nice in the absence of corroborating evidence. And particularly in this case, when the evidence all the evidence is actually against that witness.
Mm-hmm. But that requires the clear light of day and a dispassionate look at the facts. And if you look at it was almost a twofer. You have this militantly secularist media machine that seems to have paired up with Victoria law enforcement to trawl Cardinal Pell before anything was done. As I understand it, there was a year of trawling, looking for victims before any of this hit the fan. And I'm also gonna post the footage of Cardinal Pell being interrogated in a Rome prison, a Rome side room at the airport. You remember that, when he's being asked, "Did you do this? Did you do that?" And Cardinal Pell's body language is very interesting. He is much more patient than I would have been with accusations like that, but he responded with lots of eye contact, absolute rubbish, he called it, no dissembling, no nervousness, no sweating, just outrage, like as if to say that this is all you have. Is the trawling part is true, correct? That there was an effort made to find victims, to manufacture victims.
It's absolutely correct. I mean, there's been a really interesting book published by Oxford University Press, I think came out a year or two ago, looking at false accusations. What are the commonalities, mentioning, for instance, the cases in America, that rash of allegations against preschool teachers and operators, etc., and cases in Britain. And so what are some of the commonalities? And one that comes out is where police are actually not just trying to sift, they've got an allegation trying to sift falsehood from truth, but actually becoming, in a sense, a prosecuting authority. They're looking for proof. They're actually advertising for proof. And that is exactly what happened. The Victoria Police, which, in my opinion, under current management, has shown an animus to the Catholic Church and has been hauled through the coals, over the coals, for making false claims against the Catholic Church in the past, and against Pell personally, the church under Pell. They actually advertise for people to come forward. And, of course, in the context that a lot of people know, money flows. There's been a lot of talk about how much money the church should be paying, how much more it should be paying, a national compensation scheme. They actually advertise. If you were someone in the church from this period to that period, and you have an allegation, please come forward. It took months and months and months, and they finally got their person. Now, when a police force does that, it is invested in actually getting a conviction. Yeah. Which is a very dangerous position to be. It is not invested in dismissing the claim of the person who finally does come forward. They want this to be true, it's conscious in their mind, and I'm not making an allegation, but psychologically the pressure is to validate the accusation, not to exonerate the accused. And I think this is one of the huge dynamics underpinning this case.
You mentioned Curl Beach. Folks may not be aware of Operation Midlands, which is, I think, a very good parallel to this. The outrageous charges of ritual child abuse and murder and so on of upper echelon British politicians and other influencers. He himself is a pedophile, sex criminal, is now in jail for lying. But this reminds me of something closer to your backyard, Andrew, and that's the Lindy Chamberlain case. Many Americans are not familiar with that. Do you see any parallels there as well?
Well, it's not me that sees the parallels so much. It's the dissenting judge. When George Pell appealed to the Victorian Court of Appeal, now it's going to the High Court, so that's a high body. Once again, I repeat, Victoria, or Melbourne, Victoria, Melbourne's the capital of Victoria, is the most left-wing state probably in the country. Well, not probably, it is the most left-wing state in the country.
It's your California.
Yes. It is our California, absolutely correct. It just the whole atmosphere was against Pell. The dissenting judge, though, Mark Weinberg, not a Christian, obviously, listen to the name, is the only one of those three judges from a criminal prosecution background. He used to be in the head of the public prosecution department. And he went through this quite forensically. He said, the evidence is not there. I don't believe, I tend not to believe the allegations, but he made the point And I thought it was extremely pointed, extremely pointed. He drew the analogy to the Lindy Chamberlain case. He said it's happened before. And I think that was such a explosion of frustration that one hopes that the High Court in Australia will listen to that. What happened there? We had a jury convict Lindy Chamberlain of murder of her daughter Azaria. She said, and her husband said, the daughter was taken by a dingo at Ayers Rock.
Wild dogs, right? For our
wild dog. Dingoes
yes.
is a kind of wild dog. It's slightly different, but same principle. And she wasn't believed. Interestingly enough, something similar there. She was with a religious Seventh-day Adventist, was it? Anyway,
yes, that's right.
Seventh-day Adventist. So that was seen, particularly then, as very suspicious, weird fruitcake.
Dick Class A extremist nut bars, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And she wasn't showing enough emotion, which, by the way, is something that George Pell has been accused of for a long, long time, being too wooden, too stiff. Not enough emotion.
Yeah.
So the parallels are really quite extraordinary. Jury didn't believe her. Judges didn't believe her. High Court threw it out. She was gone. New evidence came to play, and she was then exonerated. But the parallels in that regard, not just that an innocent person was jailed, but those other ones I've mentioned are quite striking.
So Lindy Chamberlain, like Cardinal Pell, didn't show the kind of remorse that you'd expect from a guilty party, in other words.
Well, not just that. It was more, she didn't cry enough. You know, they didn't warm to her. In fact, they didn't like her. And she seemed to, her face didn't move and blah, blah. And it was just shocking. It was, again, witch hunt material. And it goes exactly this point. We were judging on appearances and prejudices and scapegoating. We're not judging on the facts. And I think this is so important because without the facts, every single one of us risks being found guilty of not having a nice face or not believing in the zeitgeist or believing in other things unrelated to the case that other people don't like. It's witch hunt stuff. Yeah, again, Salem witch trials, those people weren't religious enough. So, of course, I didn't quite like them, or one was too independent speaking. One of the men crushed to death, he was too free speaking. So, killing.
Yeah, Rene Girard calls this the scapegoat mechanism, where me against you becomes us against him. And this is where the phrase burn the witch comes from, which you can see this playing out in the Pell
I think
case.
that's absolutely right. And there's other levels in this too, it's a means of proving you're good. That's really strong at the moment. To prove you're good, you must tear someone else down. You don't do good work, you just denounce someone. It's a Twitter sort of thing that you're seeing. And it's very easy to denounce George Pell in 140 characters on Twitter and then go and have your breakfast and you've saved the world. That kind of thing. There's a lot of that, that kind. And also, let's face it, the church has been terrible in the crimes of pedophilia and covering up, and George Pell was in the vicinity of cover-ups. I don't believe he was part of them. I think he was part of the solution, but it's been tainted with that too. And there's a sense that the church must pay. In fact, it was a really extraordinary example of this phenomenon on, again, the national radio network we have, the ABC, where a leading actress did an interview with one of the leading presenters on the ABC, which is very far to the left, as I said, NPR on steroids.
Yeah.
A number of churches have been burnt down, arson attacks, including a quite prominent one in one of our suburbs, and a church that had done extremely good work. You go on the website and hand out food to the poor, comforted the bereaved, and it was quite active in that regard. So being a force of good. The actress came on and said she went past the smoking ruins of the church and felt exhilarated, felt fantastic, because many years ago, a pedophile priest had served there, I think, for some brief period of time. Long gone, I think jailed, long gone. Nothing to do with the current worshippers and the current priest. Yeah. And so she was glad that it would have been destroyed. And you think, what kind of thinking is that? What kind of thinking is that? I mean, the ABC itself, I might add, has had presenters accused of pedophilia, one jailed for pedophile offences.
Mm-hmm.
Do we go and burn down every radio station of the ABC around the country? I mean, it'd be a magnificent bonfire, but we certainly would not do that. It's that primitive justice. And I think we're seeing really a revolt of the stupid and the primitive in this. The stupid in particular, the people too stupid to actually go and look at the judgments for themselves and see the holes in it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that requires sitting down and reading more than 42 characters. There's a connection to the BBC with the Midlands, Operation Midlands, and that is Carl Beach said that he was raped or abused in some way by Jimmy Savile, who
Correct.
Nobody believed Savile's victims for a long, long time. The BBC pedophile. You mentioned the facial thing. Go ahead.
Jimmy Savile thing again, right? Jimmy Savile alerts us to the fact there are pedophiles, and there's no doubt about it. But to say that there are pedophiles over here, so let's hang this innocent man over there.
Yeah,
it's again primitive thinking, dangerous thinking. All of us are at risk if that kind of thinking takes hold, as it's taking hold. But the Jimmy pedophile case, again, I mean, pedophiles are not exclusive to the Catholic Church. The BBC had its own. Mm-hmm. Extremely notorious. The BBC protected its own. And do we now say, let's go and jail the Director General of the BBC for the crimes, not that he was involved himself and nothing to do with it? Jail him,
right.
Burn every BBC studio? There is something else going on here beyond simply, the church has got something to answer for. There is, I think, underlying this, an animus to Christianity itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it's been so heavily prosecuted by left-wing media outlets in particular. I mentioned the ABC, the left-wing newspapers as well. And they're now so invested in this. The ABC is actually probably per number of employees, our biggest media organisation. They have dug in so hard behind the reporters that led the prosecution, George Pell, that they will not allow a contrary opinion to go to air. And so how are they going to report it if he does get off in the High Court decision? Lord knows. That's going to be very interesting.
Yeah. You could do a drinking game of NPR stories. Everyone take a swig whenever a story ends with the sentence, and its disproportional effects on LGTB migrants. They just bang on the same drum constantly with one.
If you took a swig of whiskey every time the ABC here mentioned global warming, you'd be drunk by lunchtime.
Right. The term pedophile priest has a kind of an alliterative quality. It's like catnip to editors. They can't resist using it. When in fact, I've covered this a lot. From 1950 to 2002 in the United States, the total number of accused priests in the Catholic Church has not risen above 4%. Now, obviously, 0 is too many. I'm not bragging about it, but for the sake of context, the number of actual pedophiles, like child rapists, is about 1 in 1,000. So they conflate the worst of the worst. And whenever they treat the story of Cardinal Pell's case, they always invariably use a very unflattering picture. I mean, he looks like the Prince of Darkness or Satan. They're scowling,
That's been going on for a long time. It went on for decades before these allegations actually came out. I have to say, in Australia and particularly Victoria was really the epicenter. The proportion of Catholic priests who were caught out as pedophiles was higher. It was a genuine scandal, and there were cover-ups, one by the Archbishop of Melbourne in that diocese, Sir Frank Little. Sir Frank, can you believe it? Which was disgraceful, and George Pell is the man who replaced him, repudiated that, set up compensation schemes, new training of priests, etc., etc. Frank Little, without a doubt. Even worse was the Archbishop of the Bendigo, Ballarat diocese, Mulcairns. Absolutely disgraceful individual. So, unfortunately for the church, there were scandals here.
Yes.
But the thing is, almost every case you hear of relates to cases in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, maximum the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
If there's one after that, it's an outlier, complete outlier. We're talking 20, 30, 40 more years ago, mainly 30, 40. And yet the reporting of it would have people think that it's present almost like right now, still.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of prelates that should be in jail. I mean, it just galls me that Uncle Ted McCarrick, an actual predator, possibly a pedophile, is living in rural Kansas with three meals a day and linen sheets. Meanwhile, Cardinal Pell, for even if the accusation is true, which I don't believe it is, far less in degree and kind and gravity, sits in jail. I personally think if the Pope did something like this, he should be in jail. So the law should apply to everyone.
Look, without a doubt. I mean, I am not friends with, but like George Pell has never come to my house. I once went to his place for work reasons. I've had lunch with him once in the context of going to Rome to interview him. I've met him maybe 6 times. This is not me with a long friendship of George Pell, and that's why I'm doing this. This is about truth or falsehood. And I just see we cannot allow this kind of barbaric thinking to take hold as it is taking hold, this scapegoating. This is in this historical, we've mentioned the Salem witch trials, I mentioned those bizarre cases where people in America went to jail for long periods over absolutely absurd allegations about satanic rituals in preschools and things like that. We have to stand up and fight this kind of stuff. And for me, there's also underlying this another thing. I always think that Christianity, despite the fact that I'm not a believer, has been civilizationally a force for good. It's had its problems, obviously, but has been, by and large, a force for good. I know if I go on the street, I'm not likely to be bashed up and mugged by a believing Christian. It
Mm-hmm.
won't be one of them. Or if it's a political rally, I'm not going to get monstered by a rally of right-to-lifers. But if I go to a Greens rally, a global warming rally, boy, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
I think it's a force for civilizing people. And this, I think, George Pell is a victim of a crusade against that faith, and particularly the strongest upholders of that faith, which traditionally has been the Catholic Church.
Do you see the hand of conspiracy theorists, or maybe something deliberate and possibly provable in the timing of George Pell's work in the Vatican, reforming the Vatican Bank? He seems to have been making some headway, and I understand, I've never met Cardinal Pell in person, but I understand that he's a plain-talking man who doesn't seek after conflict, but if it comes, he doesn't run away from it. I can't help but think that the timing of his sudden ouster from the environs of Rome to face these charges, which he did quickly and willingly, is a little suspect. What's your view?
Patrick, you are not the only one to believe that. I have no hard evidence to justify it. I've been told things which I won't share, but I know that George Pell was on the trail of corruption in the Vatican. He was number 3 or 4 in the hierarchy, head of the Treasury. I know that he took security protection for him personally, but also that documents that he had uncovered about the corruption copies of that were secreted in 2 locations out of Italy, in case something happened. Mm-hmm. I also know, well, you've probably heard of it, raids on very, very senior officials, again, regarding a land purchase and etc. in London, raids in the Vatican. There is something very, very wrong, and he had been making a lot of progress on that. He told me some remarkable accounts. There have been suggestions that this timing is not coincidence. There have been allegations made about transfer of funds here. I have no idea of the truth or falsehood of that. I know there are people that are looking into that, have done property searches, etc., to get to the bottom of this. We shall see. I doubt that we'll ever know. I suspect it's maybe unlikely, but we shall see.
I was thinking when I read and heard the announcement that Justice Mark Weinberg was the sole dissenter, I thought, I hope he has some security, because the mob are going to despise him to the nth degree.
I think that is a reasonable fear to have, and I think I don't think he'll be killed or anything like that. I'm not saying that. It'll be more the mob thing. I think his fear of being berated on Twitter or abused.
Yeah, someone might call me a bad name.
Yeah, well, exactly. Has stilled a lot of tongues. And what I find remarkable, and in some ways actually quite heartening, when I started looking at the evidence, reporting on the evidence, saying this does not stack up, this is ludicrous, this judgment is terrible, particularly when the Court of Appeal, the judgment there was frankly preposterous. Every time I would mention that on my TV Sky, which is a subscription service, our advertisers would get targeted by people online, because I was about the only one calling it out. There was a couple of others, but very, very few, very few. We would face a boycott. We, one night, had not a single paid ad. We were made to pay. In time, that campaign to silence us, because people were going after the advertisers' threats and all that kind of stuff, that campaign to silence us has gone down. And in time, all other voices have come up. If you want to silence people, you're going to have to silence a lot of people in Victoria now.
Yeah.
We have had leading QCs. We've had a professor from Oxford. I think you sided with him. We have had legal experts generally. We've had the dissenting judgment from Mark Weinberg QC. We've had people on the left from the Catholic Church's father, Frank Brennan.
That's right. His Cardinal Pell's sort of ideological ecclesial foe, saying he was sickened by it. That's an important piece as well.
People saying this does not stack up. This is preposterous. And the other day, look, it would be like Mother Jones publishing an article saying George Pell's innocent. We had a Saturday paper here, a thing called the Saturday paper, which is so far left that you'd need that boat next to you to go and sail out to the middle of the ocean to find where it is, and a telescope. It's that far off the dial. And it ran a piece, again by a lawyer and a regular commentator there, saying, sorry, I can't see how it could possibly not only be possibly found guilty beyond reasonable doubt, which is actually the test, but also, whether it's possible that he did it at all. So I'm just thinking there's a shift. And part of that might be driven by, people saying, look, we got the buggers, being put in jail, that'll learn him, that'll learn him. And I hope that that's sort of taken the edge off the anger. They feel, right, we got him, and now we perhaps can just let him go because he's actually innocent.
Yeah. Yeah, that's you've given me a problem because I have 9 more things to reply, but I'll just pick one. The day before he was elected, Pope Benedict XVI, then Cardinal Ratzinger, gave a famous speech to the cardinals, and he coined the phrase "the dictatorship of relativism," which I think is a lightning in a bottle. It explains a lot of social problems caused by this relativism that's imposed on all levels. But he also used the phrase as in his list of dangerous isms, collectivism, which is at work here. You were talking about the group, the party that can crush the individual, make the individual basically mean next to nothing. So you've got collectivism with tribalism and a Me Too movement. It's the perfect storm to find a scapegoat and punish him accordingly.
Yes, well, look, society's re-tribalizing, and I know we shouldn't really complain to Catholics about that, given that Catholics may well be accused of being tribal in themselves as well, but there is a significant difference. To go back to what I said before, Christianity, it's one of the absolutely founding beliefs of Christianity, the dignity of the individual, which is why the church is so against abortion and euthanasia, that every life has a meaning. Every single life has a meaning. And you cannot justify taking a life for a greater cause. Unlike, communists, where the leadership was saying you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Lenin,
right.
People could be sacrificed to the cause. That's the whole thing about Nazism. You could sacrifice people to the cause. It's the whole thing about jihadism. You can sacrifice people to the cause. There's absolutely, Christianity is different in that regard. And it comes now headfirst into a retribalizing of society, a drive to retribalize it. Identity politics is exactly that. We identify with some unit, some collective. It's not you, Patrick Coffin. It's, that white guy that I'm looking at, or it's that Christian I'm looking at, or whatever demographic that you're supposedly representing, the oppressor. It's not you individually, what you've done or believe. It is who you represent. And we saw that Marianne Williamson in this race to be the Democrat nomination for president.
Yes,
nominee for president. How she exemplified that in scary, right in front of you, in your face, by leading a congregation. I say congregation. That was a Freudian slip, but it was a congregation.
Yeah.
Leading a meeting of people at one of her rallies, where she got all the whites in the audience to apologize in a prayer that she read out, to repeat after her, to all the blacks in the audience. No matter whether they were individually innocent, done nothing themselves, or whether the people they're apologizing to had suffered anything themselves. Right. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah, the parody and the reality have met and mated in that move by Marianne Williamson. It's totally embarrassing. And I love etymology. And the etymology, the root origin of Catholic is kataholikos in Greek, which means of the whole. It's what yeast does to a loaf. We don't care about skin color. If all you have is that you're a white guy, you have nothing, right? So your character is far more important than skin color or who your mother happened to have been.
I think that's so correct. And, it's strange that the words of Martin Luther King,
right,
once seen to be the credo of the left. This is it. I dream in America where my daughters will be judged by the content of the character, not the color of their skin. We thought, hallelujah, that is it. I mean, that's where Christianity really showed that it was for individuality. And I thought the left embraced it. And for a brief moment, it did. Now, if you quote that is now the calling card of a reactionary.
It is.
To quote what he said, hey, that's against the Black Lives Matter movement or something like that.
Right. True or false? Martin Luther King Jr. would be targeted by Antifa today because of that statement.
I think so. What would he say to the Black Lives Matter movement? He would say what some poor schmuck said the previous race for the Democrat nominee. What was the name of that governor, where all these Black Lives Matter came yelling and screaming, and he said, no, all lives matter. Mm-hmm. But he said that, bang, he was out of the race.
Right.
Out of the race. And that's a Martin Luther King creed.
Is that why your book is called Still Not Sorry?
Still Not Sorry was not quite, but it is against that sort of thing. My book of essays or columns, it's still not sorry for what we're told to be sorry for, the stolen generations, which is exactly this a manifestation of this. Mm-hmm. The idea was pushed that up to 100,000 children had been stolen from their parents in Australia simply because they were Aboriginal, and we wanted to wipe Aborigines off the face of the earth. To question that is to be a racist now. Yeah. Absolutely to be a racist. And I pointed out that to this day, forget 100,000, no one has been able to name even 10 people taken from their families just because they were Aboriginal, and not because they were being abused, neglected, starved, raped, or whatever. And it's extraordinary. It's now taught in schools as a matter of faith. There's annual apologies. The courts have not found a single such case, bar one, where only one, where a man was taken from hospital. His parents had never seen him. He was a baby at the time. Taken from hospital by a social worker, misguided, who thought he had been abandoned, had been neglected and abused, and she gave him away against the policy of the time, which is precisely why he won. It was actually against the policy. One case one case against policy, and Australia is now condemned internationally for having stolen 100,000 children because they were Aboriginal, which is totally false.
Were you surprised? This is only a very slight sidebar because it relates to this groupthink. Were you surprised at the pushback by saying something obviously true and common sense, that someone like Greta Thunberg is being used by elites and she is mentally ill, as she herself has admitted? Because I was astonished at the treatment you received for saying that in public.
Well, it's so extraordinary, but it goes to the same sort of thing. I think reason is dead, basically. Reason is dead, and Pell's accusers are capering on the grave, It's not about facts anymore. And I think Greta Thunberg, in some ways, demonstrates that, because if global warming was simply about reason and facts, we wouldn't be being lectured to by a 16-year-old who says that autism or Asperger's is what actually makes her see things more clearly.
Yeah, it's a superpower.
I disagree. I think it makes her see things so starkly Manichaean terms that she can't even comprehend some of the judgments we've got to make, and some of the opposing views. She can't even entertain them. I actually think it's a weakness. But anyway, we would not be presented by Greta Thunberg as the authority here. She's 16. She has to go to school. And we're told to listen about the complicated science of global warming, to listen to her. No, come on. We'd be listening to a Freeman Dyson or someone who's decades of experience in this area. That's what we'd be listening to. But I think this tells us that not only is it beyond reason, the people pushing her actually want it to be beyond reason, because they're saying, look, how can you possibly criticize this poor, innocent, hurt?
Yeah, she's the perfect mascot for it. She's immune from all criticism.
If you say, listen, she's absolutely wrong, well, you're picking on a little girl. And if you say, listen, the fact that she's got these very significant mental issues, she's talked about a deep anxiety, she couldn't eat for a long time, she couldn't go to school, she's selective mutism, she can't speak at times because she's so anxious. Look, this is not someone you should treat as an authority, but if you criticize that, then what a monster you are.
Yeah, and if you think that the facts are iffy, or that the Pell decision is unsafe, as the Australians say, or otherwise dead wrong, then you are backing a pedophile. There's no middle ground.
So that's correct. You're backing a pedophile. Well, I'm not backing a pedophile. I'm backing a guy I think is an innocent man. If I thought it was a pedophile, I wouldn't back him, naturally. Yeah. I mean, it's just so extraordinary. But it goes to this tyranny of feelings. It's now how people feel, not how they think. Like I said, it's a revolt of the stupid. People who judge by feelings, not thought.
You said something earlier that got my attention about the emotionless nature of the sort of grim-faced presentation, Cardinal Pell or Lindy Chamberlain. The same people that want to have magical soul reading apparatus, somehow you can detect guilt or innocence based on physiognomy of one's face. That seems to have been done in reverse with the accuser. Because he seemed to have the ring of truth. So it's like, well, you're inconsistently applying this ridiculous thing. Does that make sense?
Well, that's one of the striking, bizarre aspects of the majority judgment that the two judges who found against Pell's appeal, was that they said the fact that the accuser frankly admitted to misremembering some details, particularly about the timing. He said it happened then. In fact, check the records. Oh, then, okay, it must have happened then. The fact that he got stuff wrong and was prepared to admit it spoke to his genuineness.
Right.
You couldn't believe him because there he was, so honest that he even admit when he was wrong. You had other witnesses who were honest enough to say, listen, I don't recall ever leaving Pell's side as, take Monsignor Charles Portelli, he was the MC. His evidence was he always followed Pell from the moment he came to the cathedral to the moment he left it, and there was no way that George Pell would walk all the way to the disrobing room, the sacristy, without the Monsignor by his side. He wouldn't do that. And he was asked on the stand, but listen, maybe you didn't remember. Maybe, could that have happened? He said, well, I might not have remembered something, but I sure don't remember
Yeah.
That proved the fallibility of his memory. And that proved you couldn't actually trust everything he said. And that happened not just to him, but to another witness.
Mm-hmm.
Quite opposite conclusions. This guy's memory failed, so he can believe him. This guy's memory failed, so he shouldn't necessarily believe him.
Yes, it has the ring of truth.
Yeah. The one was for the defense. How does that work?
Yeah. Another thing that the press coverage did was rebrand what a sacristy actually is. I'm a raised, rebelled, returned Catholic, and I've been in plenty of sacristies. I've never heard it being called there was an ABC presenter, and I think I forget which newspaper described it as a disrobing room. It's where the priest vests and where he removes his liturgical vestments. No one actually disrobes in the sacristy, But that's that
goes to the wider ignorance, particularly in the media class, which is far more likely to be non-Catholic, to what a sacristy actually is, and that does go to the confusion, and it also goes to this point too. The accuser actually walked, as I said before, after the Mass, at the time that he was supposedly being raped for 5 minutes, or he and his friend, he's actually with this choir going around out the cathedral, around the side, like I said, 3.5 minutes, leaves the church procession somehow, magically, unnoticed by the adults supervising the choir, leaves this little corridor. How he pushes past all these people, because I've been in this corridor, because there's 70 or so in the procession, how they did it without being noticed. Ran around the side or walked around the side, came back in, and then doubled back, and then came back to the sacristy, where he was found by Pell, allegedly. The whole point being, the choir, at that point, with the service at the head of it, was about 14 meters from the door of the sacristy, where they're going to deposit the crucifix and the other stuff they're carrying. That is exactly where they're heading to.
Yeah.
Somehow, on this evidence, the servers don't reach that room. What would it take you? 20 seconds to get there? Yet these boys walk all this way, 5 times the distance, reach the room before the servers, are raped for 5 minutes, and then the servers arrive. How does that work? Anyone familiar with the layout of a cathedral, what happens in that sacristy after the Mass and all that, would know that this is impossible. And yet people wanted to believe it. It's that wanting to believe that is such a telltale here.
Andrew, do you think that the tide is turning in Australia and the sort of general coverage of this? Is there a kind of new sympathy in light of Justice Weinberg's arguments and your efforts and other people's that are taking a sober second look at what really happened?
Sympathy maybe is probably too hard a word, unfortunately. I do know that a lot of Catholics know this is wrong. Our archbishops have been very timid for a long time.
Yep.
And I was struck, though, that 2 declared that they did not believe him guilty. That, for the church, is highly significant. Highly significant. It surprised me that they went so far. I'm glad they did, but, well, thank goodness. What I think has changed is the preparedness of people to speak out. It's one of those things, it takes one person to speak and another person to get courage from it and say something.
It is.
Too.
It's totally
and when
true.
2 people speak, a third feels courageous. And suddenly when 20 speak, a lot more. I also think it's caused some people to look again at the evidence because it doesn't stack up. This is a stitch-up. It's completely wrong.
Yeah.
And so I now think some people are recognising the High Court may well. The High Court's a more conservative institution than the Victorian courts. And there's been some contempt for the Victorian courts for being too far of the left. So there'd be some people covering their backside right now.
This sounds
and
like,
I think they'd want to say that we are, listen, I saw problems with this too. Now
Yeah,
the
that's
little
right.
ones are saying it. They don't want to be left off this train before it leaves the station.
Yeah, people always check the finger in mouth, check the wind. Hours after the disciples said, "I do not know the man," I'm sure they were, "Oh yes, of course he was innocent."
It'll be a
But
bit like the people who said they called. I knew Donald Trump would win.
right, yeah, I
So
called it.
those that were there in the little foxhole, feeling deserted, suddenly realised that they weren't there. Apparently, there were a million people right next to them. They just didn't see them at the time.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
think it'll be like that. Suddenly I'll find I was not alone. I've had lots of people saying the same. Yeah, well. But look, I'm grateful. Speak up now, guys. Speak up now, because this is a total scandal and we can't rely on the High Court to set it right. And there are actually two battles to be fought here. One is the legal battle. George Pell gets free. The second is the battle of public opinion.
Yeah.
And that has barely begun to be fought. And I think more people need to speak up and say this is an absolute travesty of justice. You mentioned the Dreyfus affair. This is the Dreyfus affair of our time. This is a disgrace.
I think you called it OJ in reverse.
Absolutely, absolutely. If people want to know, you've got to trust the jury, OJ, okay?
Yeah.
So I agree with that completely. And same sort of things. People too scared to say X, or they think they're letting the side down by saying X. So the truth, why, gets trashed.
St. Teresa of Avila once famously said that the truth suffers, but it never dies. I'm convinced that it's easy to speak out, but what's harder is to speak out knowing that there will be backlash, there will be pushback, there will be, boycotts, and people will say bad things about you on Twitter and so on. Do you think there's some analogy between the court in Victoria and the High Court, and say Ninth Circuit in San Francisco or Berkeley and the U.S. Supreme Court? Is there some dim analogy there?
Without a doubt. Not that I trust necessarily all the judges.
Yeah, sure.
But yes, that's. I suspect that is how it is. That said, I mean, you've got a Supreme Court with people like Ginsburg in there, and the wise Latino, but I don't. One would hope that truth will prevail, and people I speak to say there are quite a few people in the High Court who are black letter lawyers. Facts must count. And whether they're sufficient, we shall see.
With the November 19th announcement that the High Court is going to take the appeal, and it'll be, I don't know who will be representing Cardinal Pell. Would it be, was it Brett something? Who was his barrister?
Yeah, it is Brett Walker.
Brett Walker.
And yes, they're the ones that lodged the appeal, and they'll take it all the way forward. So we shall see. A very senior lawyer on my show said the biggest hurdle is actually already over, and that is simply getting the High Court to accept.
I was surprised, Andrew, when I heard. I thought there's so many DACs stacked in the wrong way. I was very, very surprised. I was actually overjoyed that at least he has a shot. Because I'm ignorant of it. Are High Court justices appointed for life?
No, I think there's a retirement age of, I can't remember, 70 something. I can't remember. I can't remember what year it is, but no. But there is one young, particularly very young person on there. So we'll see. Look, we'll see. The poisoning of the atmosphere has been so extraordinary. But, if enough people speak up now and make clear, I think it's so important. And even if you're in America, speak up. George Weigel has spoken up. That's good. What I think we need now are people on the left and lawyers to make it clear that the world is watching, that the Australian justice system itself is under scrutiny here. This cannot stand. This cannot stand. It is a stain on the reputation of Australian justice. And not only that is it a wrong in principle, it's wrong in fact, it's also a sign that perhaps reason does not rule. And if some notion must be resisted, it has to be that, resisted by our justice system. So if by sheer chance you're a prominent lawyer, take some interest here and say something. Let it be known to your Australian colleagues. The word has got to get out. People have got to be given the courage to speak up, to know there's an injustice here that demands their attention.
Boldness is certainly contagious. It's 100% true. Is the High Court a little more immune to the kind of zeitgeist, the flux of public opinion being more institutional, less? I was going to say more staid, but you know what I'm asking?
I know what you mean. No, well, just having more respect for evidence. I believe it is. They've actually freed people in the past. There have been some remarkable judgments and some other courts too. You know, we have had the Archbishop of Adelaide freed after being found guilty by, it couldn't have happened. We had a Christian brother freed after being jailed. There has been a witch hunt, not a witch hunt, there's been an edge of hysteria that is now, I hope, receding. The High Court, you would expect, by temperament, is more conservative, as in, when I say conservative, more inclined to look at evidence rather than anything else. Because naturally they're at the absolute apex of their profession. There is nowhere else to go. And you would hope they feel the weight of responsibility on them very, very much. And like I say, previous judgments have suggested that is how they feel, and we shall see. But I've been so astonished and dismayed by so many steps along this way where I thought, this is so ludicrous, this can't go any further, and it did. So I remain yet to be cheered and optimistic.
I don't know what the timeline is, perhaps you don't either, but probably more in the order of months than years when the High Court will finally hear it, correct?
I think probably the earliest they will hear it is March or something like that. Let's say judgment in May. It really grieves me that an innocent man is kept in jail for all this time. But as I understand it, like I haven't been allowed yet to see Cardinal Pell, but as I understand it, because that in some ways George Pell is gaining comfort, obviously, from his faith, is gaining comfort from the example of the suffering servant, is also, I think, in a way, realizing that some period in jail is inevitable and maybe even good, not for him though, but good, in that it does take some of the heat off the church. Someone has been made to pay, not for his own sins, but for the sins of the church. He is the sacrificial lamb. And some period in jail, when he's freed, maybe some people will finally be merciful enough to let go of their anger or to feel it bathed enough that they can just retire, to their couch and think, job done. And reason might then rule again.
Well, your lips to God's ears. If people want to drill a little deeper into the particulars of the case and the absurdities of what was claimed, I would recommend episode 132 with Peter Westmore, who was at both trials and the appeal, who took copious notes. There's so many things I was tempted to ask you, Andrew, but I wanted to just stick to the appeal and just get your perspective. I want to thank you for your time. I know you're busy. As an outsider to you, Australian culture, I appreciate the work you do. Certainly in a hostile environment, you're like a heroic salmon flopping upstream. So,
well, that's extremely generous of you. But I also thank you, Patrick, for taking such interest in the case. A long way away from where you are, easy to ignore. This is actually highly significant. For a start, the man is the third or fourth most senior Catholic, right? So this should interest people everywhere. But I think it's important that you take an interest, and anyone listening to you take an interest, and make clear as you can that this injustice cannot stand. Reason must assert itself, and the church. I'm so glad to hear that some person I know was in meetings at the Vatican just recently, and when George Pell's name was mentioned, there was spontaneous applause. People know he is innocent, and this must now be claimed.
Yes, well, all we can do is what we can do. Well, as an agnostic, you have to be careful what books you read, Andrew. So maybe someday you'll doubt your doubts, but in the meantime, I think your work is outstanding, fact-based, and I appreciate your work. How can people connect to the Bolt Report? YouTube, fastest way?
YouTube, Sky News Australia YouTube. It's got a channel for me, for my videos there, and just look up my name. You will not miss it on the internet. Just go to my blog and you'll see all the references. Search Andrew Bolt, bang, there it is.
Very good. And you're on Twitter as well.
No, mate, that is.
I think someone is. Maybe it's a Bolt bot.
Well, someone does it. Some people put it on there, but Twitter is a sewer. If I wanted to go on Twitter, I'd just put my head in the toilet and flush it.
I'm trying to get over my self-hatred. I'm trying to, like Al Pacino, trying to get myself out of Twitter. But
back.
Exactly right.
It was. I've forgotten the character's name.
Yeah, Michael Corleone. Yeah, Michael Corleone moment. You're right. Well, Andrew, Godspeed to you. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Pleasure.
This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.